information is the foundation of good decision making. I mean, that's shocking to me, honestly. Are the decision makers in the sectors covering the built and managed environment really not understanding the relationship between good information and good decisions? It's clear that information management is not where it needs to be, or where I and hopefully in this company we want it to be. So change is necessary, and we heard in Justin's panel discussion earlier today about change management and culture and competence. And as Teresa said in that panel conversation, we often see change management as a point in time intervention, and the need to move to a longer-term continuous journey actually is what's out there. And these change management programs are often in capital delivery or asset management projects. But what about the other stakeholders? What about the funders? What about cost managers, legal profession, insurers, and others? Could they help us maybe think a little bit differently about this change journey? So I am absolutely delighted to welcome our fantastic panel who are going to be talking about these and no doubt other topics. Dan Hughes of Alpha Property Insight and founder of the Red Foundation. Gary Bell, Director of Real Estate Digital at Turner & Townsend. Stephen Boyd, Director of Longstone Consulting and Major Projects Advisor at AtkinsRealis. And Simon Lewis, a partner at Womble Dickinson. So let's get started. Is there a commercial imperative for change, and how does information management impact the combination of short, medium, and long-term decision-making required in the built environment? I wonder, Dan, would you be up for kicking us off?
Yeah, good morning. It's fantastic to be here. I think the short answer to this is yes, there's definitely commercial imperative. I think if you look on the IMI website, then if you've got cutting costs, saving time, improving quality, and delivering better value, all of those have a commercial benefit and a commercial advantage. I think the key question is, who are those for, and who are we targeting those messages for? Because I think different people have different drivers. So value will be particularly important to some people, efficiency will be valuable to others. And I think sometimes from an information management and from a general data approach, we've tried to put all of those benefits together and tell everyone that there's a lot of benefits, whereas actually maybe we need to be a little bit more nuanced about who those benefits are for. I think the other thing to say is it won't be a surprise that the built environment is generally an incredibly large, complicated network of different organizations and ecosystem. And so the advantage that we benefit someone commercially isn't always because of something that they do themselves. So a pretty extreme example of that would be if a building is running very efficiently in 10 years' time because of better information management, then the occupier who's going into an office building may not know about it at the starting point, so they're not going to benefit from that for another 10 years. And so if they're not involved with the decisions up front, how can they possibly influence them? So I think that we've got a really diverse, complicated sector where there are lots of commercial benefits, but different organizations will realize them in very different ways. And I think that the final thing I'd say, and I know the previous session, culture came up a lot. I do think that we're a very evidence-based sector, and that's a very good thing because that's exactly what we want to do to make sure we're doing the right thing. But if there is no evidence of those benefits, or they are theoretical, it's very easy for us not to build them into decision-making or use as an excuse not to do something. And so we need to be much better at publishing data and evidence on what those benefits are, so it can be built into the decisions or even the valuation process at a later date.
Thank you, Dan. And I think we'll probably come back to some of those topics for a little bit of a deeper dive as we go through. Gary, when we were chatting a few days ago, you had a perspective on this question of, is there a commercial imperative, and what is this information management impact on short, medium, and long-term decision making? What's your view here?
Yeah, morning everybody. I think I guess the question for me is, why does it matter? I think every decision in the built environment is only going to be as good as the information that sits behind it. If that information is incomplete, untrusted, then ultimately we're building risk into the system from day one. In terms of short, medium, long term, I think short term poor information management means delays, means disputes, inflated contingencies, affects procurement decisions, contract negotiations, and even the ability to mobilise quickly and effectively. I think in the medium term, it's impacting operational efficiency. So think like compliance failures, unexpected maintenance costs, ESG reporting gaps. They're things that sort of erode trust with investors and regulators. And then in the long term, I think it just undermines the asset value and also the strategic portfolio decisions. If you don't know what you own, you can't optimize it and you can't sell it at the right time. So the commercial imperative for me is very clear. Trusted information is reducing risk and creating value at every stage. If you imagine, I don't know, a developer could cut 6 months off a project timeline because the information that they've got is structured, reliable, trusted, verified from day one, then they're in a position where they can save millions in terms of financing costs, faster revenue generation, and gives them a stronger competitive position. Whereas if you've got the opposite and a project's delayed by 6 months because of missing data, you're completely at the pitfall of information management, and that is the cost of ignoring it.
Yeah, I think that it's a really great point you make, Gary, there. I mean, I think we all know, I mean, just look at, national infrastructure, from national infrastructure down to just small, single building refurbishments. All the time we're seeing things not really going according to plan, right? And I think you make a strong case that oftentimes that's information, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, right? But information management is getting in the way for sure, or at least not allowing us to see far enough into the future to anticipate what's coming. And I wonder really, if we're moving on from there, how, you talked about lots of different stakeholders there, and I wonder how the value proposition for information management varies across these stakeholder groups. You talked about asset owners, there's that delivery phase, supply chain, so architects, designers, developers, contractors, etc., lenders, insurers, lawyers, there's lots of people in this chain. And then there's the operational phase, supply chain as well, which is some of the same people, but it's also like fund, investment, asset and property managers, facility managers, still the insurers, still the lenders, still the lawyers. So perhaps, Stephen, we can come to you, and what's your kind of take on this variation across the stakeholder groups?
Good morning, everyone. Nice to be here. I absolutely agree with Dan that different stakeholders in what is a rather fragmented industry see the value in quite a different way. And I think it's important to recognise that different stakeholders have different value perceptions. Understand what they are has got to be a first step. And once we've understood those different perceptions of value, then there might be some actions that we can take to begin to align those perceptions. But even if you do that, one of the really important things to do is to make the consequences of decisions visible to those people who can do something about it, which is primarily CFOs. So the consequences of decisions need to be available in a financial way that someone can do something different as a result. So let's have a little look at some of the main stakeholders. So if you take asset owners, for instance, they know that the majority of their costs are from the long operation phase. Perhaps 70% of those costs in that operation phase. So they're focused, or at least they should be focused, on long-term decisions that drive value. The delivery phase is quite different. That is quite a short-term environment where the stakeholders are focused on getting to the end of that project in a smooth way. And the key to the transition here into the operation phase is the project handover. And in some cases, the project handover can be set up to create the platform for long-term value delivery. But in many cases, it really isn't. And it produces almost a stop at practical completion. I'm sure most people would say for the operational phase that those people involved there are very aligned with the value perceptions of the asset owner. I would challenge that. I don't think they are. I think that reasonably short-term contracts, low margins, and data silos often mean that building asset managers and facilities managers are driven towards very short-term decisions, and there's undermine rather than enhance value. So the thing that I aspire to do and encourage others to do is to try and align the perception of value across all of the life cycles. You recognize the difference, but do your best to align them. And I think the steps to do that are, first of all, focusing on long-term whole life decisions rather than short-term decisions, and making the consequences of any short-term decisions that are made visible at CFO level. And then there's something about procurement. So making the contract requirements for project handover very aligned to whole life, and letting contracts for the operational phase that reward long-term planning and long-term decision making rather than short-term quick fixes.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, that we see, you talk there about a lot of operational phase kind of short-termism, I suppose. And I guess in some ways that's the parallel of the delivery phase value engineering, in the sense that it leads us to do things that have perhaps a short-term apparent benefit, but in the long term are often terrible choices.
Yeah, if I may,
Simon,
that's a really good example of value engineering. So value engineering is often described as long-term value. In vast majority of cases, it's not. It's about value in as far as the short-term nature of the project only. A long-term approach to value engineering would get to quite different answers.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we might come back to if we've got time is that relationship between kind of value engineering in general, but also then how you do your information engineering. If we're going to manage information well, then we need to define things like information requirements. And I wonder the extent to which that process itself, in fact, is sometimes the victim of the same kind of thinking that leads to poor outcomes from value engineering when that's done badly. Simon, I'd really like to bring you in on this. What's your perspective on this kind of value proposition across the stakeholder groups? I mean, as lawyers, you must see quite a lot of the different stakeholders, right? Oh, Simon, have we got you? Perhaps not. Well, hopefully Simon will be able to be back with us momentarily. I will let our team behind the scenes find him in this virtual world and bring him back. I just wondered, Gary or Dan, do you want to comment on this kind of the variability between stakeholders? I mean, either in the delivery phase or in the operational phase.
Do you want to go, Dan? Do you want me to answer? I mean, my quick take, I guess, on it is like for funders, the value is confidence, ultimately confidence that their capital is protected, their investment decisions are based on fact, not assumptions. For insurers, it's about pricing risk accurately and reducing exposure. For lawyers, which Stephen referenced, it's about sort of having enforceable contracts that are preventing disputes and protecting liability. For contractors, it's sort of fewer errors, less rework, predictable delivery, and for the end user, the operator, it's life cycle performance, ESG compliance, and the ability to adapt an asset to its future needs.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of those. So I agree with everything that Gary and Stephen have said. I think the interesting question is, given how many commercial benefits there are, and there are clearly a lot. I mean, Gary's made a great case for all of those for different stakeholders. Why are we not seeing more traction and more engagement from some of this to really drive this? Because if there are so many benefits, how do we speed up that delivery? And I think that goes back to Stephen's point, which is about the different value propositions for different people. We've got to make that case much clearer. I think that ultimately an awful lot of the built environment decisions are driven by the owners of assets, who are often driven by long-term value decisions, but at the moment there's not the evidence to build into that to demonstrate the value, or legislation. And I think that we need to be very careful about legislation, where I think that's a very useful tool at times, but it's also can be quite disruptive as well. And I think we need to, as an entire sector, come together to work out what those value propositions are, and how do we better make those cases, and how do we legislate for them in the broadest sense where appropriate. I don't think it's appropriate all the time by any stretch.
Yeah, and I'm very minded, by both what you said, Gary, there, and your comments, Dan, that a lot of these discussions we have are not so very different to our, the financial crisis in 2008, in the sense that we had poor information management, poor decision making, we had poor regulation in many cases, we had predatory behavior going on, and it's a tragic echo of that when you look at things like Grenfell and the terrible outcomes arose from fundamentally very bad decision making. And if you read through the inquiry reports, definitely relationships there with availability and use of information in that disaster as well. Simon, can you hear us? I saw you briefly on screen there. Still struggling, I'm guessing. Okay, so I wonder, Gary, let's come back to you. So drilling a little bit, you talked a bit about risk and you talked a bit about value there as well, but perhaps you could kind of focus in on what do you see as that relationship between information management and risk, or information management and value, asset value?
Yeah, I mean, I think risk and value are probably two sides of the same coin, two forces that shape every decision that we've got to make in the built environment, both directly influenced by the quality of information that is produced. I mentioned it before, but when information is incomplete, inconsistent, unverified, uncertainty ultimately creeps in, and uncertainty is expensive for everybody. It inflates the contingencies, it drives up insurance premiums, and ultimately creates that ground for dispute. So every gap in the information is a gap in confidence. That gap translates then into cost ultimately, and that's the risk side of the equation. Now, when you flip it, when information is sort of trusted, structured, accessible, it becomes a strategic asset. It enables things like compliance, it supports ESG reporting, which I mentioned before, and ultimately it makes assets adaptable to future needs. It's the difference between an asset that depreciates and one that becomes a platform for growth. And in fact, I'd probably go as far as to say information is the only asset that appreciates over time, because the more that you use it, the more valuable it ultimately becomes. What does that then mean for us as a collective? It means that information management isn't just about avoiding problems. It's about how we create long-term value, turning data into confidence, and then ultimately confidence into capital. If you have an example, if you've got a fund manager who could increase portfolio value by 5% because every asset had verified life cycle data, you'd end up with an impact where hundreds of millions of pounds is being added in value without actually ever laying a brick. Or if an insurer, which I mentioned before, the last one, reduced premiums by 15% because risk exposure was proven through structured data, that then isn't now a theory, it's actually the commercial future of our industry as we know it.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting relationship between good information and therefore information management that leads to that, and insurance and risk. I actually spent some time at Zurich Insurance and seeing how underwriting takes place, which was an eye-opening journey, let me tell you, but seeing how that takes place and the degree to which information is used by insurers in most areas, it's quite scary when you look at the information that's typically available in the built environment for insurance purposes, how little and unreliable it is. And likewise with lenders as well, of course, securitization. Simple things like knowing which properties are part of which securitization. These are oftentimes just not that straightforward. Dan, I know we've spoken in the past about the relationship between the value process and information management. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that perspective.
Yeah, again, I mean, I agree with what Gary said there about the adding value to the asset long term becomes incredibly compelling. I think it's about how do we get the evidence to that to make sure it's built into any evaluation processes, so the evidence and the business case can then be made. So I think if you look at two identical office buildings, which by definition is impossible, but if you assume that they are, and you have one with a set of keys, the other one has a full digital infrastructure model, the perfect everything that we want in the way of data and information, It's pretty well documented that can run more efficiently. You can have less vacancies. You can probably charge more rent. So it's clearly there is a value in that today in a building. What isn't really available is the evidence for valuers to build that into a valuation process. So if you value the two buildings today, it's very difficult to recognise that in the traditional way. And part of that is because we're very evidence backward looking based approach to valuations. So for me, the case that better information management adds value short term and long term is very, very clear to make theoretically. It's about how do you actually have the data and the evidence to build that into the valuation process. So the fund manager who needs to invest X amount of money today can see that it will very clearly deliver X times 5 in the next several years. So I think that the valuation process is a large key to unlocking this, because that is about recognizing the long-term value of short-term investments. And I don't think we're there yet in a scientific way. And
do you think, Dan, that, because obviously certainly in the UK and in many other parts of the world, valuers are regulated. In the UK, the ICS perform that function. But what do you think the role of the regulator is?
Well, I think there's an interesting debate around valuations generally, because clearly they do need to be evidence-based, because you can't just make up numbers. They need to be evidence-based about what is the value, how's it done. The problem is the drivers of change and value are changing, both today from where they were 20 years ago, and in 20 years they'll be different again. So it's very difficult for valuers to build it in. I think the challenge for the regulator, and absolutely they have an important role here, is how do they balance those two different things? So how do they balance the value of a building in 20 years is going to be very different from the way it's calculated today, but also it needs to be evidence-based. And I think there are a couple of different approaches. There's certainly a move towards DCF valuations, so it's becoming more about income over time. But if you look at where buildings are going to be in 20 years, the valuation is going to be much more about the data infrastructure that it has there, both from an efficiency point of view. I also think it's going to be about actually making commercial revenue from the data that buildings have as well. I think there are other things that will be much more intangible, like things like brand, for example, and they need to be considered much more in the value of the property long term. So the regulator has a very important role in moving the sector at the right pace to make sure it's making those decisions that are long term, but also making sure that they're evidence based at the same time.
Yeah, that's kind of incontrovertible, isn't it? Stephen, I wonder whether I know that you have quite an interesting example of kind of what good looks like to some extent here from the Government Property Agency. I wonder whether you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, no, happy to. The Government Property Agency inherited a large estate from multiple government departments and found that the quality of that data was very poor and it was inconsistent. And at the same time, the GPA was undertaking a program of major projects. And so it needed a consistent end-to-end approach to data that would apply to projects, project handover, operations, carbon net zero, etc. And so as a result, introduced what we call the Better Buildings Information Management Program, B2IM, which set out to solve exactly that problem. And so working with AtkinsRealis, we improved data quality over time that allowed regional portfolio management to be integrated with low-level asset management within individual buildings, got a much better understanding of condition and backlog that allowed improvement in maintenance, and importantly, here's the thing that gets on the CFO's desk: reduction in cost and an improvement in customer experience. And I think the lesson there is that to be genuinely valuable, you need to take that end-to-end, whole life, long-term view of value and the data that supports those long-term decisions in the way that's been described here. And on the one hand, you'd say, well, the thing you really need to be able to do is to measure data maturity. And if you've got better data maturity, more complete, more accurate, up to date, etc., then you're bound to do a better job. And part of me wants to agree with that, except that it's a bit of a techie thing and it's difficult to get over the line in terms of understanding, particularly at C-suite level. So it's much better to talk about measuring long-term cost, customer experience, those kind of things, reduction in backlog liability that are much more in the language of the people who are making the decisions. So I think the GPA and the B2IM program is a great example, and continues to be one that could be applied more broadly.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Sue. I think that's really interesting. I know from my own experience, I spent some time at Zurich, as I mentioned, looking after their global operational development. And one of the things that we looked at there was our use of the real estate, corporate real estate in the portfolio. We had Zurich Insurance operating in like 45 countries. We had about 600 active buildings. And we spent, certainly when I joined, we were spending about $750 million a year on essentially rent, the cost of that real estate. And we started actually looking at what information was available, because really none of the information that could be used to understand what space we needed, as opposed to what space we had, was known. Even it's not that it was collected and not used. We didn't even know what it was, and so we did a bit of a study, and we gathered lots of information about not just occupancy, so using things like security gates and security badges to gather information about people coming and going from the building. We did some tracking using a bit more advanced technology, locating people in buildings and tracking where laptops get docked and Wi-Fi connections and all of that. But actually, you said, Stephen, to get to the CFO, all of that stuff is noise in a lot of ways. And we had a situation in Zurich City where we had, I think it was 13 buildings altogether, but that was concentrated into really 5 significant buildings. There were a few smaller offices. And one of those buildings was a brand new building that we literally just built. And it was the headquarters for the national kind of Swiss part of the Zurich Insurance, because the Zurich Group headquarters were there as well, occupying most of the rest of the space. And we were trying to say, look, can't you accommodate some of the group people in this brand new building you've got, because we reckon the space. And he was like, no, there's not space. And it boiled down to the reason he thought there wasn't space was that feedback on 2 issues with the building. One was you had to queue to get the lift up to your floor in the morning. And the second was you had to queue to get lunch at the cafeteria. If you walk around the building, there was loads of space, loads of meeting rooms, loads of desks to work at, loads of huddle spaces. The office provision was perfectly adequate. So again, we used data. We measured actual, because the smart lifts in this building, right? They reported on load, capacity, run times, all of those things. And by being able to actually go back with answers to those specific concerns, we actually managed to get him to agree to that. And that was part of a program where over the course of 3 years while I was there, we reduced that $750 million a year to $500 million a year. And we reckoned at that point there was probably at least another 150 million that could be taken out. I mean, in terms of a commercial imperative, those are starting to be very significant numbers, even for a company the size of Zurich.
Yeah, no, I recognise exactly that kind of thing. In the GPA, we did similar, taking 100 million, nearly 100 million, not quite 100 million out of the annual budget for central London in the same kind of way. Let me give you another example about how data can be integrated. This case is about a prison that had real challenges with cost of energy and with performance of ventilation, etc. And historically hadn't really considered how those things were linked with external and internal environmental conditions. So this is actually a glider technology project where they took that data and integrated it. And saying, look, we've got better data, it's now integrated. Instead of having different sources, we've merged these silos, it's joined up. That doesn't get anyone's notice. But if you can say 20% annual reduction in energy costs, 200 or nearly 200 kilograms of carbon per person per year taken out of the system, then people start to notice. And that is the thing that really gets the C-suite to paying attention. And sometimes you get really interesting knock-ons. So from that glider piece of work, for instance, there was another thing that came up, which you could see how inmate behaviours were affected by environmental conditions, which is something that no one expected to see, but is very useful to know.
Fantastic, thank you, Stephen. Well, we're pretty much at time, so I'm just going to wrap up here. And what I'd like to do is perhaps give each of you the opportunity to call out something that you think would be important as a takeaway from this session around what leaders and managers can do to identify and respond to the commercial imperatives that we've been discussing for information management and change to improve it. So let's go, Gary, first. What would you say?
Yeah, I think if there's one takeaway that I would leave today, I think it's probably this. Information management isn't about technology, 3D models. It's not just about design and construction. It's ultimately about trust, risk, and value. If every decision in the built environment was based on verified, structured data, we'd ultimately have faster projects, lower risk, higher asset value, and stronger investor confidence. Change will ultimately happen when we stop asking what does it cost and start asking what does it unlock. And organizations that embrace that mindset now will absolutely lead the industry tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. Dan?
Yeah, sorry, I got slightly distracted by jumping off the stage there, but I think I'm back. So I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. There are two things for me. One is there are so many commercial drivers for better information management, but they apply to different people and resonate with different people. And I think we as an entire sector have to be very clear about who is particularly driven by value. Efficiency really drives some organizations or some job roles, but not others. So we've got to be very clear about that. And I think the other thing is we've got to layer that with the short term and the long term different perspectives. Some of these things are going to be short term costs, but long term benefits. And we have to have the evidence for all of that to be able to back up those short term, long term arguments about efficiency or value to make sure we're telling the right message to the right people.
Super. Thank you, Dan. And in our closing seconds, Stephen.
Thank you. So my one thing is a procurement thing. So I think leaders and managers can insist that their contracts for all parts of their supply chain, whether in the delivery phase or the operational phase, include crystal clear requirements to provide the data necessary to make long-term decisions. And they should keep challenging, does that data allow me to make long-term decisions? If it's only about short-term decisions, it might be interesting, but it's not important. Long-term whole life decisions from data that's in contracts, insist on it.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, panel. So Dan, Gary, Stephen, and Simon, at least in spirit and in preparation for this, thank you so much for joining us today. Join us in the IMI room afterwards if you want to meet the panel and have more questions, and I'll hand back over to Paul.